That should be good. Okay, so as I was saying, yeah, don't be turned off by this concept of design visualization if you immediately think of some V-Ray renderings, because we are about that, but we're not all about that. And what you see on the screen are some past events that we've had. We can say we have a monthly meeting, but from time to time we take some months off. But you can see just from this list in front of you that it's very broad. We like to say that we're looking at things as cutting edge as virtual reality and as old fashioned as a pencil and paper and everything between. And we're doing this all in real time using all these different tools to approach design. A few things that you may have seen here, like looking at Enscape, talking about diagramming, and other things really tie into our discussion today on animation. And that's kind of what is the heart of this group, is that it's really, we're not trying to find this one conversation, but realizing that it's a continuous flow of many different aspects, and frankly, not just ideas, but people. So we want to, again, hear from you all and build this group into more than a committee, but really a community. So Ken and I co-lead the group. Ken is with Sasaki and I'm with SMMA. Ken, you want to just mention briefly your role there, and I can mention mine?
Sure, yeah. So I head up a small group at Sasaki called Sasaki Strategies, and our focus is on data visualization and kind of design tools development. And we also do a little bit of animation as part of our work. So we have some folks from Sasaki, from our group on the call, and we can potentially be showing some of that later as part of the big conversation.
Mm-hmm. And I lead the architecture group at SMMA. We're about 70 architects, about 220 people overall, with architects, interior designers, engineers, inventors, scientists, everybody you can think of. But what I do want to show here is probably the first motion picture I can think of, at least with my brief research. This was in 1878. And from what I understand, the impetus of this was to come clean on understanding a bet between two people. They wanted to understand, with a horse, is there any point in time when all of their feet are off the ground? And this proved to be the case. If you look at that third plate up there, and the person who put this together won the bet. So I think that's an important segue to understand why we do animations. And this is a very short example, a 15-20 second example of one of my students, Patrick Gable. I teach also at the Roger Williams University, and he was researching a project and trying to show this really elaborate facade and how it's constructed and the purpose of each part of it. And he determined, well, the best way I can think of is just put this gift together. The interesting part about this also, because I think it really tells the story of this project, and it won the day in as far as presenting to each other, but also it tells the story of how to put this together. So he did this meticulously with SketchUp, moving every little part and piece using the same view, and then exporting, I don't know how many millions of JPEGs into Photoshop, and then knitting them together and producing this animation. So it just shows it shows those two things. What is the purpose? What is the motivation behind putting something together? And then how do you do it? And we can talk much more about that later. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and introduce Nadir Tehrani and Matthew Waxman. Nadir Tehrani, if you are familiar with his name, you may have heard of Office Da, or currently NADAA, NADAA, which is his current practice. It's a firm in Boston. He can talk more to that. Also a dean of the Cooper Union, and a prior department head of MIT. I first saw his work in projects back in 2008 or so with the bank interior. That's BANQ. Look that up. Really beautiful, innovative use of wood, and in the McCollum building in what's now the edge of the Seaport District, and many projects since then. So he can talk more to that, as well as Matthew. Matthew's a collaborator former collaborator with Nada, and is sort of the mastermind behind putting together some of these animations. So hope to have some really great questions of the behind the scenes later on in our conversation. So with that, I'll hand it over to Nadir and Matthew. And if you'd like to share a screen and let me know if I need to press a button.
Mike, before they start the presentation, I just wanted to mention for the folks who came into the room late that the last part of this presentation is going to be kind of a show and tell, where everyone on the call, if they have examples of animations, it'd be great if you can kind of share those with the group, and you know, if it's something you made, kind of tell us how you made it, or just tell us what you like or don't like about it. So I just wanted to say that up front in case folks want to pull something together for that session at the end.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Thanks for that, Ken. And then also during this presentation, this will be about, let's say about 20 minutes or so. It's meant to be, meant to stir up questions and get us really thinking about animation. So if you have questions throughout, and hopefully you do, put them in the chat. We can either have Nadir and Matt answer them as they're looking at the chat during the conversation, during the presentation, or just have hopefully a larger conversation after the fact. So please do write those down. And as Ken said, start to compile some of your own images that you want to show afterwards. So I think we covered everything.
Michael, are you able to see my screen?
Yeah, I can, Matthew. That's great.
Okay. Thank you so much, Michael. I appreciated your introduction. Nadir and I will tag team in the presentation. You began by noting the technical conditions of animation and what it allows us to see. That's really important observation. It's really about the technical conditions of the medium of drawing, and medium representation, and understanding the technical conditions also of architecture and architecture thinking. So a tale of architecture beginning sometimes in a conventional sense will begin with the plan. In this case, the plan might be thought of as a generator, as a typical origin story. Plan is generator for understanding dynamic conditions in space, program, experience, as well as tectonic relationships. Chose to show the Noli map because it's actually an illustration of a dynamic relationship between architecture and an urban condition in tension with one another, as well as the Louis Kahn's Dominican Mother House, which itself a product of iterative working, iterative drawing, and it infers a sequentiality that can be legible in the different spaces as they interlock in the circulation and have sequential consequence on one another. Similarly, the Sana Rolex Center plan is one that is encoded with contours that are descriptive of something that is expressive of changes in section that are more than what we would assume might just be encoded in a plan.
I'd only add that like other forms of representation, the plan can be deemed as an instrumental device in being able to do certain things that other media cannot do. And so if the Campidoglio is part of an urban context that is a registration of time and the collisions that buildings produce, Kahn's building orchestrates that all at one moment. And so in this hypostyle hall that we develop, Matthew, it's not really showing right now. I don't know if you're attempting to play it.
Sorry, step back for just one moment.
All right.
There's a bit of a lag.
Right.
Okay.
So insofar as each medium is able to represent an idea, this hypostyle hall, or conceived as a hypostyle hall, shows us the ways in which each column can become magnified or scaled up to become inhabitable spaces. This is in fact an open hall that supports programmed space above, but insofar as that building was really about an open market space below, it was a very critical thing to show the generative aspects of a given type, the hypostyle hall, that is historically seen as static become a dynamic thing that can absorb space making.
So it's important to think about also the ideas of what does it mean to put images in sequence. At the top is Picasso's Bull's Head, which is a example of collage with a bicycle seat and handlebars, and it has to do with the juxtaposition of objects to create new meaning. Similarly, Sergei Eisenstein, who himself was a former architect, pioneer filmmaker, he theorized montage by taking sequences of images and juxtaposing them together in time in order to make new meaning, such as at the bottom, a mask and a statue. And he termed this to be an illogical sequence to create another type of meaning. Similarly, he had the idea of logical sequences where you might have an image of a lion asleep versus a lion awake and what that might produce in sequence. The diagram at the top, which is one of his diagrams, is not A plus B equals C, but rather A and B then infers a motion, which is what it equals. The image at the bottom, Edward Muybridge, similar to what we saw at the beginning of the presentation, we see a sequentiality of images that are descriptive of motion that we're able to read.
This is, for all intents and purposes, a static image in the sense that the camera is not moving. But if you look carefully, it becomes a vehicle for us to test out different iterations of scripted works that would suggest that how fabric formed. That didn't really show, Matthew. It was really touch and go. You may want to show it again so it's smooth, but essentially it was meant to show how a smooth surface is tested out in various iterations of fabric formed concrete work so that that smoothness can give way to a form of rustication as the tests evolve and as the wall goes into the building. And so the rippling that you see, again, on my screen, it's completely fragmented, not smooth at all. I'm not sure if you guys are seeing it. But that's
a bit jumpy with me as well.
There is an option in Zoom to optimize for showing video. If you are screen sharing, you can say optimize, like there's an option to say just like render the video a little bit better. It will like hide a little bit of the background. So it might help for the animation sequences.
Where is that option?
If you go when you're under screen share, if you hit the screen share button, and then it will say on the bottom where it says like share video or share sound, there will be another one that says optimize for video. You might have to hit screen share again. Sorry to derail. Yeah, if you hit screen share, there should be another one that says optimize for sharing video clip.
That is grayed out for me.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, me too. That's weird.
Looking at it as well, it's grayed out for me. But
yeah, it is choppy.
The challenge of the technical aspect of trying to show animations, especially in this remote world.
This is
It
more.
looks like
This is more smooth on my screen now. It's not high res, but it actually does fulfill the kind of ambient effects that we were trying to produce. Notice that as a static image, it's really the shadow and the rustication that are doing the animation work for you.
Mm-hmm.
so. Sergei Eisenstein also used the sequencing of images in terms of creating storyboards. This is a storyboard for his film Alexander Nevsky. It's a combination of sequential images to create a montage, but also diagrams. When we developed animations for various projects, we also used storyboarding quite extensively. Storyboarding as essentially the sequencing of diagrams. We'll begin with diagrams and then think about the relationships between things such as the site and a building in sequence to understand the consequences between them.
For the Adams Library project, we were asked by Michael to present that as part of this session. And that storyboard is really enacted here in motion with a monumental face on the front facade and a diminution of those pitched roofs on the back in correspondence with a promenade in the back. Resulting in a fifth facade, a roof on which all of the triple deckers look down on for the release of water in the back alley. At the same time, a matte building that is otherwise dark is excavated to bring in natural light in the south while framing an oak tree in the north. We went from plan to axonometric here with the roof lifted off. You see the cross grain of the beams of the roof in contrast with the directionality of the shelves, revealing what will become the sixth elevation, that is the reflected ceiling plan, as a critical part of the experience of this building, as the acoustic baffles and beams become a central part of the conception of this project as one navigates through it. So as I go through this description, maybe I can ask you to go back one slide, Matthew, to show the storyboard, because in fact, within the context of that storyboard, there are many different ideas. One has to do with the urban notion of placing a stoa on a main street that is otherwise quite domestic. The other has to do with the dialectical condition of the monumental facade versus the broken down residential roofs. The third has to do with the whole notion of water mitigation and how that becomes a kind of sustainable strategy for the water garden in the back. The fourth has to do with a monolithic block essentially getting cut open into a tripartite area, one for kids, one for adolescents, and one for adults, with a kind of control station in the center. And so the narrative goes on, that these are somewhat semi-autonomous narratives, but they're brought together through a seamless condition. But that seamless condition is going from plan to rotation in isometric, and then a very clever and slow changing of the camera lens from the isometric lens to the perspectival as you go in and through the building.
This idea of translating from different modes of architectural projection is something that I think is actually latent in a lot of architectural thinking about how do we think about the way in which space is organized, but also how we see it, and how we think about it, and how through the seeing of it, we can actually understand it in different ways, whether it's understanding in plan or Choisey's axonometric or the perspective. This technique is something that Nada has explored in a number of different animations as well.
But with that idea comes the notion that that the representation is not an illustration of the idea, but that the idea is embedded in a form of representation. It's a prerequisite for it. In this instance, for the Villa Varroise, we go from plan to demonstrate the anomalies that a building type takes in relationship to the shape of the site. that same deformation happens in section as a courtyard building steps down to conform to setbacks of the zoning and codes. So too, the distortions of the roof open up operability between the east and the west, while revealing that the building, now stepped onto itself on two levels, allows the landscape to extend up and through the building as a landscape building. Again, this is another instance where we went from a planimetric condition here, very diagrammatic site plan, to a rotation, which is effectively a sort of elevation oblique here. And then you're beginning to see going from isometric to perspectival representation. And while you're going through the perspective, your lens is shifting from a 50-degree lens to a 15-degree lens by the time you get to the end. So a kind of technical description of what is going from an analytical model to a conical model of representation.
I want to speak a little bit also about conventions in narrative storytelling, as they also play a role in representation and in architecture. The Yokohama Terminal project of FOA is an interesting example because it is represented in diagrams, architectural drawings and diagrams. On the left-hand side is a sequence of sections, which is descriptive of the building. If you imagine essentially an anatomical section progressing through the building, which animates the building. But what it animates is also the subjective perspective of the human subject, which is described also in essentially what I read as a set of storyboard illustrations for the views on the site. To me, this is very interesting because this describes the idea of the protagonist in the story. In this case, the human protagonist, as the protagonist is a human subject. Protagonist, of course, being the main character of the story. The protagonist is the one that experiences the consequences of decisions, and it also propels the story forward. In this case, the human perspective or the views is registered by the sequencing in the sections.
That idea of successive animation is represented here by an elevational diagram of ramps. It's stuck for me. I'm not seeing anything.
I know, it's for some reason this stuff is so choppy.
Yeah. So let me describe as a succession. It is the embodiment of a series of ramps first in green, a series of social spaces, and then in the amber yellow, a successive structural connectivity between all of these elements to frame the space, the framing essentially of the atrium. Do we have other representations of this? I believe you have the elevator version of this, right?
Yeah.
See if you can make this work, because it's a very clear diagram.
I'm going to jump out of the land of Zoom to try and see if it works better.
Matthew, if you also want to just try that screen share option again, I think I changed the setting that may enable.
Oh, you
that
did
now.
change the setting. Okay.
I tried to change something. Yeah.
Shall I unshare first?
If you unshare and then try and share again with that setting. Yeah.
Okay. Let's try again. Still choppy.
Alas, technology comes back to bite us. I think we can go forward. No, I mean,
Okay.
You're going to see this space once again, so it's okay.
So the next slide to describe sort of ideas here is the camera as protagonist. And I think this is an interesting notion in the context of a conversation about how we see architecture, but also the technical conditions by which we draw it. These at the top are stills from Michelangelo Antonioni's famous film, The Passenger. The second to last shot in the movie is very famous because it's a single take where the camera begins in a room, passes through a window with a metal grate, goes into the courtyard outside, pivots and does a 360-degree rotation, looks back at the space where it was. And in film theory, people like to talk about this as an example where the protagonist is the camera itself, because the camera becomes an eye that observes the situation or the context where action happens, but the camera's movement itself, the blocking and the cinematography, propels that action, so it becomes a protagonist. But it's also interesting to think about the technical capabilities that made this possible. The images at the bottom, which are admittedly a little small, show the camera inside the room, passing through the grate and into the exterior. And I think this is interesting in our case as well, because there's also the technical conditions of drawing and how we do this work. This was actually the first time in a conventional cinematic sense that a gyro-stabilized aerial imaging system, that's what this camera was used in order to make this happen in a conventional cinema. Originally, that had been developed for military purposes, and Michelangelo Antonioni, a cinematographer, appropriated that technology in a new way in order to do that. So they were thinking about the technical constraints of the medium of filmmaking, but also how they could innovate within those and through those technical constraints. Mm-hmm. But it also describes motion and movement.
So the typical fly-through of an animation, of course, tries to emulate the kind of realistic promenade that one engages in confronting a building. I'm still seeing nothing there.
No.
I'm not sure if we're seeing anything, but in this instance, because that same space that was depicted in the prior animation of the atrium is intercepted by the view that you would get of that space through an elevator. It's a kind of collage, because that's what elevators do, especially when they're glass. You're seeing different realities as these clips of floors go past you. And reveal the different strata of the building, from the basement to the ground floor, the second, and the top floor where the skylight is. I guess you have the other animation right underneath it. Is that correct, Matthew?
Yes, sorry about that.
Maybe you try that to see whether that works now, because from an analytical point of view, that's a more telling piece. So the ramps, the stairs, the public spaces of gathering, and then the structural elements that merely are a connection between these elements, triangulating and giving them lateral stability, but also the kind of liner that shrink wraps the space. Mm-hmm. And so it's a reminder that the successive nature of filmmaking actually has also in it embedded this idea of the successive nature of structural systems, or the successive nature of floors as you go through them. So in a strange way, the first animation sort of foregrounds the importance of the successive nature of the structure. In the second, the elevator helps you to understand the successive nature of sectional change from one floor to the next.
Mhm.
And in this case, the intent was that it was a glass elevator, so that this is not just conceptual, it's also embodied in the experience.
Similarly, as a precedent example, showing Jerry dives into the pool, which is a Hockney art piece, which is a compilation of photographs that are juxtaposed together. And what's interesting about this, I think, in the context of what we're discussing, is that we're seeing an aggregation of fragments that we read as a totality, but we also read those fragments as instances in a sequence. And so that sequence shows both parts and wholes at the same time, as well as both conditions of space and time simultaneously. So this, I think, speaks to what Nadia was just pointing out with respect to the animation of moving through the elevator, as well as the sequences of sections, the juxtaposition of sequence and parts.
So that notion of part and whole is captured in this second modality of concrete work, counter to the first one in fabric form. The idea that cast concrete may be cast in panels, foregrounding the importance of aggregates within it, such that when the aggregates as stone become larger and larger, create an inversion in the figure ground such that the concrete essentially becomes the mortar holding the rocks together by the end, as it becomes a conventional stone wall in the landscape. This transition is tectonic, essentially goes from smooth to rusticated, but over the length of that wall, the cast panels are also revealed in the animation through time and through distance, the way in which one needs that dimension to successfully undertake such a thing. I mean, we've seen this kind of tectonic treatment in Taliesin West. We've seen it in San Sebastian by Moneo, but that the revelation of the arbitrariness of the dimension of aggregates is not something that we've come across every day. And so this underscores that idea that concrete is not smooth. Its expression is subject to these nuanced decisions we make about the specifications of the aggregates.
I've chosen to show also Doug Graff's diagrams of the Villa Savoye and its transformation into a conventional palazzo type. What is particular about this is the way in which Doug Graff animates the Villa Savoye as well as a palazzo type is by making sense of axes, circulation, essentially the conventions that constrain the palazzo type in order to make a transformation through those constraints. That idea of the flexibility as based on the conditions of materiality or spaces is something that Nader can speak to in the Casa La Rocca project.
So what Doug Graff does is he misinterprets the malleability of wings of buildings as if morphologies are that malleable. But bricks, as we've seen in Jeffersonian walls in UVA, show their undulations to develop lateral stability. In this folded wall in Casa La Rocca, now 25 years old, we undertook that same rotation that grafted at the morphology of a building, like a building wing. We did at the scale of a brick. And by rotating each brick in relationship to each other, we were able not to cut any bricks, and fold the wall along the diagonal lines, allowing for a freestanding garden wall that is laterally stable with the introduction of light and air through its pores in what we call a variable bond. It is rooted in the idea, also in an animate idea, that the bonding of walls are not necessarily fixed. If you take a running bond or a Flemish bond, they're actually not two different things. They're two integers that are part of a parametric connection to each other. If you take the mortar line from 3/8 inch all the way to 3 inches and break them up into successive images, that is what enables, that's the kind of generative detail that enables the lacing and the opening up of that wall.
This idea of the way of seeing architecture, its materiality and spatiality in an animate way, is something that is also seen in Preston Scott Cohen and Carl Dworkin's diagram series for the Tel Aviv Art Museum. What's particularly exciting about this precedent is that on the left-hand side, they began with essentially typologically normative museum galleries, which were rectilinear in shape. By rotating them in proximity to additional pressures from other types of site conditions and other programs, the repercussions caused them to pivot against each other, which is what led to, in that project, the formation of the central void known as the light fall. So tracking the changes and understanding the ways in which the characteristics of typology, the characteristics of materiality enable us to see them in an animate way that allows them to become something is an important idea, as well as a storytelling motif.
We also work with notions of transformation from the generic to the extraordinary. Here, how a domino frame illustrates the kind of structural transformations of the necessities for transfer beams or cantilevers as they engage the landscape, or the raking of auditorium spaces, or the diminution of weight as you go up the building. I mean, in the Issam Faris Institute, the structural model became the embodiment of the relationship between structure and skin, insofar as this was a building not so much in an urban context, but in a floral one, in a bosque of trees in the heart of the American University of Beirut. It was really the ficus trees that were informing a kind of tectonic strategy about how to plant this building in the middle of the woods. And here you see the site of this building delicately placed behind the row of palm, then cedar, and then the ficus.
A whole another part of the conversation of animation are, what are the algorithms and methods that allow something to be animate in a literal sense? This is the equation for a sine wave, more of a placeholder for perhaps broader conversation that we might have eventually in this session about these techniques. Sine wave being an important and one of the important algorithms that can be used for ease in and ease out type algorithms for animation. I'm going to play the next animation from the computer. Nadir, would you like to speak to the measure, the kinetic measure?
So this is a project we did out of pure love for the storefront of art and architecture. We were asked to submit something for them, a prior drawing or something like that. But we took on the project of the storefront itself to demonstrate how Stephen Hall was working through possible representations. Here you've seen us go from elevation to flat axons, now against through the perspective, going from an analytical mode to what can be called a perceptual mode, going between actuality and representation, and coming back to some notion of realism as we back out into the street again. But notice, more importantly than anything else, that the way that this is conceived is through a series of parametric shifts. All of this is rooted in a series of equations that are non-visual in the first instance and regulated by essentially instructions, the results of which are what you see here in the animate construction of the pivoting panels here in elevation, shadowed, the flattened axon that emerges out of that, and the planarity of that wall as revealed from the side elevation that eventually flattens out to allow for the conical to be introduced in it. But we are now, it's funny, we've always been able to think like this, but our access to, let's say, both the complexity and the power of computation allows us to iterate, test out, and exercise complex thinking in the context of non-visual phenomena that have a radical impact on the formal, spatial, and material qualities of buildings. And so in great part, a lot of what Matthew and I have done together is toggle back and forth between you know, the indexical and the representational at the same time. The indexical being the kind of the cold calculation of integers on the one side. The representational is that which the effect that we want to produce, the visual reciprocity that is its byproduct. I think that's it, right?
That is it. I've thrown in a couple of slides of illustrations from working method, but as usual, so much Grasshopper screenshots don't tend to say very much, but we can certainly have a conversation about that as well as working method as well. But anyways, that is it. So thank you.
Excellent. No, thank you. This was terrific. Gave us so much to think about. I know we talked a little bit before together before having this event today, and my mind was expanded then. And in seeing this and seeing some more, my mind is expanding even more. So I'm sure others are in the same boat at the moment. I put a few questions in the chat just to get us kind of connected to some of the work that you showed. And there's so many more questions I could ask, and I think so many more that others have as well. So why don't I just pick out a few here and ask everyone else to put in the chat some of your questions, or to at least identify if you want to ask them yourself. I know that we're very used to these Zoom meetings being facilitated by someone and looking at a group of questions, but we also want this to be a roundtable discussion, as it were. So if you want to ask questions yourself, then please just raise your hand. Maybe Matthew, if you want to stop sharing your screen, we can see some faces.
Sure.
And those that you want to put up your Zoom hand or put up your actual hand, and we'll see if we can get some more conversations going. But I had a couple of specific questions about some of the work that was shown here. And the first one that I had here was the articulating facade that you were showing from smooth to rough. and you were just watching the facade morph. What was the story behind that? Was that to show a client the range, or was it for your own personal design exploration?
Look, material explorations have been a project that we've been invested in for about 25, 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
So we're constantly doing that, and we do those through installations, through mock-ups, and through an independent project, which is not always aligned with a particular commission. After 20 plus years of work, this was the first time that we've been confronted with concrete. And what's strange about concrete, unlike brick, wood, glass, and many other construction types, that its expression is not the result of the aggregate stacking or layering of materials. It's not like clapboard or brick or stone. It is smooth. And you realize that the expression of concrete is either the result of the formwork that you put a priori, or the kind of processes a posteriori of bush hammering and other things. So we asked ourselves a basic question. If we were not to pursue a smooth strategy, which is fine, but it's not the only way of doing it, what aspects of the landscape could we conjure up in a building that is meant to be about the landscape itself? If you were to go to the site of this building, you'd realize that you can see all of the villas in southern France, but this is the one you cannot see because it is essentially stealth in the landscape. The sectional setting, stepping that you see and all of that is part of that. And so I posed the question to the team of what does this mean to do this iconographically or materially? And then we realized that there's two fundamentally different paths. One is representational, what a building looks like. The other one has to do with its constitution. Not so much what it looks like, but what is its core material? What are its aggregates? And so in one, the rustication looks like rustication because of its plasticity. In the second, it is really the embodiment of the core constitution of aggregates in a wall. I mean, the pebbles, the cement, the admixtures, the rocks, as it were, they are all in evidence in that case. And of course, being the architects that we are, we prefer the latter. As it turns out, the building was built completely differently anyway. It was value engineered. It had a substantial budget, don't get me wrong, but those operations were not within the reach of that budget. And so we went with sandblasted wood, a totally different project. But my answer to you is that we're constantly doing these kinds of mock-up / installation research anyway. And then we begin to see where they become instrumental to certain commissions. So no, the clients were not involved in that at all. But of course, they were involved in a great many other things in the house. And, you know, like any of you that are doing projects, you're doing 5 schemes, 5 options, 10 strategies, you know, subterfuge, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, to make sure that the project floats at any cost under any circumstances.
I can appreciate the work, the material study work that you're doing with actual physical mock-ups as well, because I know that's part of your practice. And I'm wondering, from the idea of representation, Matthew, and you had on the screen there a grasshopper interface with that study. How much of it tends to be digital versus physical, or it's just whatever? I don't know, is it speed that you make the decision to do one versus the other? How do you make that decision?
I mean, there's the project of the architecture project that's being pursued. There's also the project of the representation. You know, doing an animation like this as well as doing a model, each of them, you know, as Nader was describing with the effort to illustrate the changes in the rock wall, each of them is a study in its own right, a kind of mock-up to understand the project as well as the ideas in the project, both to express the ideas, but also to understand them. They also, whether it's a physical model or an animation, it requires a significant amount of planning, a significant amount of testing and iteration. You know, I mean, when I'm working on an animation, you know, it might be 30 different Grasshopper files that I am assembling together to simply test ideas, you know, to simply say, okay, well, how do I visualize a particular idea we have for a diagram in an animate form? How do we then translate that particular diagram into another diagram? You know, it really is a question of design in its own right, but it requires a significant amount of planning and trial and error to figure out what it is you want to do. So they're projects in and of themselves, I think.
Mm-hmm. One story that should probably be told is that Matthew came to the office at a moment in time where, you know, we were on our, I don't know, third or fourth generation of animations. And so I went to him on a project that I've been working on for over 30 years. Because when we first did Casa La Roca, we sketched the idea, the parametric idea, on a notebook with pencil, articulating what would it be to build a variable bond. Then, when we came back to the office, we redrew that again, this time drafting it with 2H lead on, you know, trace paper, and the entire project was drawn once in what was then the conventional mode of representation in projective geometry. Mm-hmm. Then it was at that moment where the modalities changed, and we went from drawing by hand to drawing by software. So we took it into AutoCAD 5 years later, because that was the time in which it was being prepared for construction. The clients divorced, and their divorce was commemorated with the first animation, the first one that you saw, that shows the intellectual modality within which it was thought through, which is analytic. It's part diagrammatic, it's part photographic, it's part rotational, and all of that. And then there's a whole sequence of animations that were done another 10 years later. That's when Matthew came into the office, where he was essentially attempting to teach us how to script, where again, similar to the Stephen Hall animation, we did sequences within which we show how the running bond and the Flemish bond are joined together, how they rotate in section, how they become three-dimensional and torqued, and the integers are running crazy on all four corners, showing how the brick is operating and how the XYZ axis is being impacted by it. So
there, I can show that while you're speaking.
Yeah, you can. I mean, and the purpose for that was to demonstrate that sometimes ideas are independent of the forms of representation within which they're generated. I mean, all of these ideas we had in pencil and in sketches, but not a good way of representing them. But the ideas are computational at their core. And I thought it was very important that in this instance, that we bring to that project an idea that was implicit within it 20 years afterwards to demonstrate how it works. And so this, everything that you're seeing now is only about 5 years old, but that's about 20 years after the project was sketched, conceived, designed, and built through model.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask a question building on that. Is there any change to your thinking after seeing how it's represented in, I'll call it a new way, or at least technologically with some different visuals? Do you think back of, I would have changed something perhaps?
Well, this is the whole point. You're thinking that we would have changed something in the design, but you're not imagining that even in our own minds, we didn't have an ideal that we were trying to fulfill. when an architect can do two things. They're the architects that design buildings, and they strive for an ideal. Then there's other architects who don't care about that building, but the systems that underlie them, and that can be deployed in many different configurations, shapes, forms, etc.
Right.
We were interested not so much in this building as an end condition. We were interested in the systems that it could deploy. And by the way, this system was built eventually in China in the Tongshan Gatehouse, which, and you can see that on our website. It is, you know, fully deployed in terms of the expandable, contractible brick configurations a couple years later. And to that extent, I think it's important that we think through systems and ways of deploying architecture as much as we think of end results.
Mm-hmm.
I want to add something. You know, I think, Nadir, your point about computational thinking and the ways in which the design of the project is embedded with that is extremely important, because one thing that I think is important to highlight in this animation, which is actually embedded in all these different animations, is the juxtaposition of, on the one hand, seeing an animation play as a product of playing out the variables that are encoded into the system of the design itself, or in this case, the malleability of a brick wall in aggregate, you know, a rigid unit, but in aggregate, it has a type of plasticity that can be malleable. At the same time, there's also a layer on top of that of, you know, changing how the camera moves, zooming in and out, things like that. There's an interdependence between them in the storytelling, but there's also the technical conditions of animateness and animation that are in both of them, I would say also independently of moving the camera, but also the geometry flexing and adjusting because of the technical conditions that we're encoding into the geometry itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. The one thing that I'll mention just as a segue, and perhaps if others have some things to share as well, we do want to broaden the conversation. That I can see three things. This is a vast over exaggeration of simplicity, but there are three things that I see. Is one is standing in a place, watching a building transform, watching it parametrically, you know, flex. Another is what we would all see more often in a walkthrough, where you're walking through a building that is not flexing, it's not morphing, it's a still image, essentially. It's a three-dimensional image you're walking through. And then we see many examples here today where you're walking through a space as it's morphing. And those are really some great ways cinematographically to think about storytelling. So do others have any examples as well that they'd like to share?
Yeah, Mike, I can share one. Yeah. Share my screen here. So hey, I'm Eric. I was in this group like almost a year ago now, I think. I came to a meeting or two, but it has been a while. So this was an animation I did more to document the design of a class neighborhood. So the neighborhood is a regular shape. Let me actually go into here. So this is the step diagram. Started with a square, breaking it up into 4 different pieces, and then sort of providing circulation corridors between those program elements, pulling a center void out of the center as like a project-based learning space, and then some vertical connection because this is stacked one on top of each other. So I had taken that, created this guy. So you can see how that shape gets sort of broken up. The circulation gets pulled out of the center, and then creating additional program space that's shared at the core. And then it became sort of plug and play with the other spaces. So the green that's dropping in were additional small group learning spaces, and then that vertical circulation. And this was done, let me probably halfway through the schematic design phase, so pretty early, but just really to document the concept. And the project now is about to submit the bid set. So recently we did a full animation. Actually, I think I have it pulled up here. A full walk through this entire building. So this is as the space reads currently. Give you a better idea. And this is a long video. We don't obviously have to watch the whole thing, but. So one of these being really diagrammatic, sorry, and then the second here, more of a realistic interpretation of the space.
I'm curious, Eric, with this animation as you're walking through, this was modeled in Revit and then viewed in Enscape in this case, right?
Right, yeah, it was all keyframed in Enscape. So we did it in, like, as you can see, it's a 13-minute video, more or less. So we did it in, I think, 4 or 5 sections and sort of stitched them together.
Are there any points in time where you're walking through a space, you pause, and then maybe the time of day changes? So maybe the building itself doesn't morph, but its environment morphs?
So we didn't do that here. There was another project in our office, another school that did a similar walkthrough, and they had done that. So you sort of get to the school at the beginning of the day, you walk around for most of it, and then they sort of come back out of the school and start walking around. And there's a point where the view stops, and then you see the sun change over, and you get that sort of end of day feel, which I thought was a nice way to tell the story of, you know, arriving to the school and then leaving at 3 o'clock.
Yeah,
I think particularly with these kind of experiential videos, it's interesting to think about all of the parameters that can change. You know, obviously, you know, being able to manipulate the design itself, as Mike said, like being able to manipulate time, being able to manipulate your position, or even like where you're looking, particularly as you kind of incorporate other ways of looking, such as virtual reality, right, where you're kind of an active participant within this model, which is another kind of form of animation. So even if the model's it's still the images you're seeing are animated to give you that sense of being there in that space.
Right.
Nadir has to go, so I just want to say thank you.
Sorry about that. I need to step out into my next meeting, but Matthew's going to stay and just thank you for the invitation. If you have any questions, I'm happy to respond via email or otherwise, but have a good afternoon, everyone.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
for your time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
And building on this, it does harken back to what you had shown earlier, Matthew, with the Adams Street project, the video that was informed by the storyboard. You know, it's just seeing that flat storyboard and saying this is the sequence 1, sequence 2, etc. And Eric, did you have the same sort of storyboarding process?
Oh yeah, so I don't have it pulled up, but we had we iterated sort of that path. So we had a diagram that circulated around the designers, and it was sort of, okay, we want to hit these main points. We put some stars on different spaces, and then we also wanted to keep the workload to a bit of a minimum. So this project has a lot of repeating elements, and we don't obviously want to take up a lot of time showing spaces twice. So the path helped create a sense of scope for what needed to be brought up to that level for rendering. It was really helpful. So yeah, the planning that you mentioned, Matthew, in the beginning is critical for things like this. Super important.
It's probably an interesting fun fact that Matthew had an interest in something other than architecture prior to architecture, right? Do you want to share that with the group?
Sure. You know, actually, this is quite pertinent, I think, to the conversation we're having right now, actually, because as was the question that you brought up earlier, Michael, about modes of viewing in animation, objects that move, moving the camera, and then moving the camera with objects that move. My education prior to entering architecture was in film. And it's interesting that you bring up these differences, and similarly the examples that we just saw with, you know, Eric's work is striking on that as well, because there was the diagrammatic mode that was analytical, that was showing a certain set of ideas, and then the second animation was something that might be considered to be a type of walkthrough. In the world of film, when you're planning a film, you have different ways in which you might communicate what you're trying to do in terms of developing the narrative. In terms of the representation of that within the film medium, you have ideas such as montage, which a lot of people trace back to the work of Sergei Eisenstein, which I was showing some images from earlier, where you're juxtaposing images, whether logical in sequence or illogical, in order to convey meaning, or what he would call dialectical collisions. Or you might have a single long take where you might have a camera just positioned in one location with objects or characters moving in front of it, or the camera itself moves. The cinematography has the camera moving. The technical terminology for that is blocking, both for the movement and the positioning of the characters and objects in the scene and setting, as well as for the camera, how it moves. And I think it's important to be conscientious of both of those, because montage as a filmmaking technique, as well as the long take as a filmmaking technique, I believe it would at least have major implications in terms of how we read and make sense of ideas of space in different ways. They construct space in different ways. One is sequencing images or clips to convey a certain type of spatiality as it conveys over, again, time through difference. Whereas the long take is where we're seeing a space in its totality in a more sort of smooth sense, because the camera's moving, or the world is moving around the camera. But there are two different modes of understanding space and understanding the technical conditions of the space, as well as the technical conditions of the filmmaking or the animation, and the mechanics that allow us to understand that. For essentially, one is editing and one is camera work. And I think understanding those two and studying those two is actually very useful in terms of diagramming, in terms of sequencing diagrams or storyboarding, as well as putting it in an animate form. I think there's a lot of remarkable examples in both editing and montage, as well as long takes, that I think are worth studying in terms of how do they convey space, how do they communicate space. Michelangelo Antonioni has a lot of his films exploit the long take specifically. The Passenger, of course, being the second to last sequence being the most famous one that he did, but it's done in many other films that he has as well. And of course, Eisenstein, of course, being the most famous from a montage standpoint. But I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, how you communicate with the medium. What are the technical parameters of the medium, and how do you work with that?
Yeah, and I can really appreciate the kind of education you've had to have such a deep knowledge of film and methods, and to apply that to architecture that we've seen today as far as representation. And it makes me think about this broader place that we live in, that maybe without knowing what we're seeing in movies, seeing all these different methods, but even seeing something as simple and ubiquitous as things like TikTok and Instagram and all these things that are just flooding our psyches through these devices that we have, maybe not us in the group, but the coming generation, perhaps even more. Like, those are also changing our expectations of cinematography in a way, wouldn't you say?
I think so. I think it's actually a remarkable observation, because any medium that you're working with, I think it's worth looking at it in a critical way for the creative opportunities latent in it. If we, you bring up TikTok, I think in prior conversations, the topic of VR and AR has been brought up. In any of these media, understanding how it works is critical. If we went back to, over 100 years ago, to the beginnings of filmmaking, it's essentially the same thing. People were exploring these ideas, and ironically, it was also an attempt to translate the technical considerations of the real world, the physical world, how people saw the world through other art media, as well as through physical embodied experience, and communicate that in film. The very beginning of film history, we have George Méliès, who had the famous film, I'm sure you've seen clips of it at some point, of the man on the moon, or Man in the Moon, where this essentially the origins of special effects, where there's a face in a moon and a rocket ship that lands in it. And then the opposite of that is the work of the Lumiere brothers, where they took a camera and simply put it on I guess it was a horse-drawn carriage, and ran it through the streets, just filming the city. No editing, nothing, just filming the city. Both those incredibly different, both those incredibly powerful in terms of constructing a reading on urban space and a reading on human experience, as well as trying to say something about it. And I think the same type of criticality as well as imaginative approach can be taken with any form of visual media that we attempt to work with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
So quick time check. We have about 15 minutes left. Does anybody else want to share anything? I noticed Tatiana, you had posted a few links in the chat.
Yeah, I just put links in case it won't work here. I'll try. Can I?
Yeah, that'd be great. Just if you can try share screen.
Trying to guess. Yes. So it was sorry. So it was a drone footage, and it was shot.
The screen share yet? I think it's a two-step process: share and select.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
There we go.
Can you see it? Okay. And I just wanted to hear your opinion. So it was like early morning shot, and then it's going to be midday shot, and just would love to see which one do you think represents the building the best.
Is this something you had put together?
Yep.
Nice.
Wow, it's very seamless, I have to say.
Thank you.
So what are you actually rendering that in?
Oh, it's Maya.
In Maya. Oh wow. Okay.
Maya is Arnold Rendering. Okay.
And it does bring up the other subject of having other moving parts around the environment, not just the lighting, but having people and cars and animated players.
Well, I think that is really interesting, like the juxtaposition of kind of drone footage or any kind of existing conditions, and then doing storytelling on top of that and into that medium.
Mm-hmm.
But the drones are really interesting because it's also moving, right? So it obviously technically makes it a lot more challenging to do, but it's very powerful to connect the two.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and Tatiana, is some of that actual drone footage, are you knitting them together with digital and actual?
Yeah, so it was independently.
You froze up a bit with me anyways.
yeah.
Namborkin is 3D, so there's like creative people who went on a location. It's in the Michigan in Arbor, and they did a whole lot of shooting, and a couple of them were drone aerial, and also some just to show the city, basically tell a story about this place and about places where people can go who live there. So they wanted to show like all walkable, whenever you can get.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty close. So they there is like a third link. It's to our on our company's website, the whole movie, like it's 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting process because we they as a company, they had some kind of brand, it's not their first video, and we tried, like our company tried to kind of shift them a little bit. they wanted to do like Vivaldi for season and everything like, you know, like anyway. So we tried to convince them to do like different moods, different music, and when we were choosing between those two shots, like early morning and midday, early morning was much harder to do from a sense of animation, because when you have like, we use the Z-pass, it's like a distance parameter to kind of to simulate this fog, because it was kind of foggy as in the morning. And when you render, your render is very clear. And so using the Z-pass, you basically blocking the your part of a video. Midday was much easier, because it's basically whatever you see, it's about the same. And so it was a long story. And finally, we have our own firm version on our website. And for clients, we did whatever they wanted with their music and different story, basically.
Well,
So,
I think you bring up the fact of having some finished product. Am I unmuted? Yeah. Some finished product that has some accompaniment. It might be music. I haven't seen, but I've heard of ideas of as you walk through a space, being able to hear the ambient sound of that space. It's like you can hear in my house. as you're going through a large auditorium, hearing the, you know, the bustling of people in seats and so forth. It does actually tie back to a presentation that we had a year and a half ago or so on oralization, where we looked at an actual study of how spaces sound as a way of visualizing them, if you will. So it might be a good time to circle back on that and see if we could create experiential videos, experiential animations too. But soundtrack, musical soundtracks are definitely things that keep us, they keep us paying attention to the visual. And I found, and let's talk about this as a group too, I found that that sometimes you have the same video with different soundtracks and it feels completely different. You know?
I'd like to make an observation about Tatiana's work. Thank you very much for sharing this. You know, it's very interesting because, you know, I watched the videos that you shared with us, and I also went to the website that you put in the chat, and I was looking at some of the other videos in there. And I just want to note that it is particularly challenging to sequence clips in a clear and communicative storytelling way. And it reminded me of the importance of the topic of pacing in filmmaking, which is, you know, how long a shot is, and how do you then make a decision about when you move from one shot to the next. And that's something that I think is worth looking into, worth studying. You know, the team of folks that worked on this, it's very clear to me that they're experienced in that. Michael, you just made a comment about sound. I actually just want to, I have a little bit of a disagreement with you, I have to admit, because in filmmaking, one of the tricks that people will say is turn the sound off, actually, because sound is such a powerful aspect of understanding narrative in the moving image that great sound can make something so much more than it visually is. Similarly, horrible sound on top of remarkable visuals will entirely ruin it. From a cinematography standpoint, you know, a good point of advice is turn the sound off, at least during production, to focus on the images, to focus on the sequencing, the pacing. The other comment I have is to look at and study various conventions in filmmaking, not to see them as rules that have to necessarily be followed, but to understand why they're used. You know, one example would be the convention of shot reverse shot, which you'll see used in a conversational dialogue format of when you see one person speaking and then the other person speaking, understanding where they put the camera, understanding where they put the lighting. Why is that a convention? How is it useful in terms of understanding somebody speaking to another one? Similarly, and this is no doubt related to themes in architecture, understanding directionality, axiality, the kind of grain of a space of an action. You know, if somebody's throwing a baseball and it goes off screen, you know, screen right, but then it pops out, you know, the other side for somebody else in a way that's disconnected, then that sense of continuity is going to be broken, which might be intentional or it might not. So see how the editing is done and paying attention to those conventions to understand why they become conventions, I think is a useful thing to do.
Yeah, we could dig in. We could spend so much more time talking about this. I feel like we're just getting started, and we're actually 5 minutes to the end. And we
Yeah,
do
we
want
probably have time for one or two more shares if someone else wants to volunteer.
Yeah, well, please do. And I will say that this sounds so great to continue this conversation too into next year and to maybe have some smaller group discussions. There's so many things we could talk about, and I don't mean to close the door certainly, but yeah, please, if anyone else is willing to share something.
Yeah, I can share something real quick. All right, let me do. Let's see. All right, I'll just do the screen. Okay. So over at Sasaki, we've been doing some like kind of learning how to figure out where animations kind of fit and why we would use them to kind of bring you know, things to life. So one of the challenges that we've kind of had is while we've been developing some of our VR like prototypes and skill tools, a lot of that content tends to be 360. So we've had to kind of think about ways to capture videos that would help actually show things in full 360. So here is a video that just kind of is actually discussing a little bit of a tool we were making called Paramorphic. That was a VR prototype that would allow a user to be inside of a space that they're working on and have a model version of that space, and they would be able to model and change the density and the style of the facade, parametric facade here. So I'm going to try to, I don't know if I can pause it, but there's my little avatar there in VR. And you can kind of see as like what I'm doing in VR here is just kind of brushing and allowing like the facade panel to change as you're brushing it. But you know, while we're kind of testing and developing these ideas, it was really hard to kind of share this without having someone like strap the headset onto their face. So these videos here that were done in 360 allow us to kind of think a little bit more about how do we share things from VR that, you know, allow people that don't have access to headsets to, you know, kind of experience those things and not just a flat format. And so also what we've been kind of doing too is not just looking at 360 videos, but also how do we like kind of start to take some of the content that we might be teaching or kind of showing to people and start to kind of make these animations that would help us kind of like you know, I guess just kind of start to like bring to life some of our presentations. So we usually been developing a workflow that helps us take illustrations that we've done in, you know, Illustrator and bring them into After Effects and start to make these diagrammatic ideas a little bit more vibrant. And you know, it kind of layers into presentations and stuff. And so this is a little bit more about just talking about the workflow and technique in that sense. But and then here is another thing that we've been kind of getting excited around is panoramas. It's something that we've seen as an adoption towards, you know, not having things be just two-dimensional and a flat screen, but still have that flat screen element, but have things in a 360 world. So here we've been just starting to animate in some of the panoramas and understand how we can explore that. Sorry if I'm kind of rushing through this, but you know, just trying to hit some of the fun pieces. I'm gonna skip this one. And so another thing too is if you haven't had a chance to try it, Google Earth Studio is a really fun tool for actually animating camera paths within Google Earth. It's free, it's on the web, and it's pretty easy to use, and it exports right into After Effects. And so we were using this animation sequence to also tie into a tool that you'll see later on that, you know, they were trying to explain the boundary lines of the site to the clients. And so what we were using in Google Earth here was just passing a camera around to let them actually understand the whole entire let them understand the whole entire like sight lines and where we can start to think about where like this university here, how they can actually start to make different entrances into the building. So this tool here, well, the thing you'll see afterwards is something that it's called the street edge view, which kind of shows something at the edge level or the street level within Google Maps. But so here you're actually seeing something at the like, you know, kind of a top view level, and it's just giving you a, you know, an overall view. But then when sorry, oh no. Oh, okay, cool. So then this kind of pauses, and it actually, like this animation sequence flips into another tool that we've built that actually takes all these sequences and just puts it into this series of stop motions. And here they're showing like, here's the entrance to a gate. And then we are basically just almost like walking down this street and helping them kind of get that first person perspective. And this is really just, you know, a stop motion sequence. And what's nice is that presenter, like the clients, the team that we're working with, they would use this in their PowerPoint, and when those changes would happen, or like the you know, they can just pause there, and like, you know, their presentation doesn't have to be like rushed through an animation sequence. They're able to have their breakpoints, and they can address what that, you know, why we did that dynamic element. And then when that breakpoint happens, they can have that moment of rest and can kind of conversate over it. And the last thing here I'll show briefly is just the is this part here where we're talking about, we're doing like a series of diagrams for kind of a concept thing. And this was just taking a series of diagrams that they already have created, and then you know, kind of animating that into like kind of show the partee. And so, you know, it's, again, this is another thing where we're taking content that we've already created in Illustrator and bringing it right into After Effects. And, you know, After Effects is a whole beast in itself, but, you know, you're able to kind of start to understand how, you know, things like you do, like you're doing and by hand that you understand that could be dynamic, and then you draw it out in Illustrator, you can actually easily, well, not easily, but like you can start to bring that content into a program that allows you to visualize and render out that animation. And, you know, it helps a little bit. It does tag on a bunch of more work, but, you know, I think what we've seen from storyboarding these out and having people actually integrate it into their presentation is that it helps like people visualize things spatially a little bit more, because they're seeing, you know, like the overlaying of ideas rather than the full composition at once. So and then Scott, I don't know if you want to just tell me real quick where to go through with this.
I can. You know, we're a little past 1:30, so I'm happy to keep talking, but I want to acknowledge that if we need to stop, please just let me know. But if not, I'll keep going.
Yeah, let's go a few more minutes. And this will be a teaser. I think we want to do a deeper dive definitely at another time. But yeah, please do, Scott.
Okay. Yeah, so with, you know, I kind of wanted to show a little bit about some tools that were a little bit closer to the design process, or animations of the design process itself, not just the product. You know, we develop a lot of tools and strategies that try to pull tools and data more into the design process and really help designers test ideas more rapidly based on data. So in this one, this is an example of doing some real-time ray tracing. Ray tracing, something that often you kind of set it and forget it, and you come back and see what the result is later for different environmental analyses. But the goal with this, you know, slightly abstracted sort of semi-scientific tool is not to provide that answer, but instead to generate insight. So how can this animated process actually start to build up knowledge or build up insight, not just for the final thing, but for the designer to use even down the road. Next. So, you know, these are pretty powerful in and of themselves. As tools, you can kind of understand how different geometries might be shading or reflecting light, but also when you see them side by side and you can kind of compare design options across a few different things, it starts to really give you a sense of how changes that you make in the design process have an impact, much more than a static image would do.
Sure.
If you go to the next one, even working with, you know, something that's kind of a black box problem, like an optimization algorithm, you know, there is actually a little bit of knowledge happening behind the scenes, or the black box algorithm is actually you know, optimizing based on certain things. And by animating that process, you can begin to understand, oh, well, actually, it's that slant of the fin array that the algorithm seems to be optimizing for, or seems to like, or it actually seems to like how the light is bouncing off of this flat piece. So that insight is something that you can take with you beyond just the kind of final result of the process. And then the other 3 slides are about shoes, so it's a little bit of a different scale. It's a little bit of a different scale, but in this one, it was a process to help kind of bring life to data. It was about developing a shoe or a midsole that was very responsive to the full range of pressure across the step. So even kind of animating the pressure sensors that happen in those right images to show how the kind of heat map of the pressure changes. And if you go to the next slide. This project was developed around the idea of auxetics, which is kind of a weird geometric pattern whereby when you push in one direction, instead of the material kind of squeezing out, it actually compresses in. And conversely, when you pull, the whole thing expands in all directions. So it's a very strange structural, I won't say phenomenon because it's fairly normal, but using animations to actually show both the theoretical concept on the left and the kind of simulated midsole on the right really helped to understand how it was working and how we could kind of improve it. And then the last slide is just showing that exploring that design space and really investigating that helped us to understand what the parameters were. And by doing that, we get to kind of focus on this project as more of a platform. So it wasn't just the static result at the end. It was more about the kind of dynamic platform behind it, the real-time design, understanding how things change in the design process and in the final result. So yeah.
Well, this is great. So certainly, Scott, David, Tatiana, Eric, you're invited, and Matthew. Even though Matthew, you're on the West Coast, you're invited to this group at some time next year. Ken and I will discuss when we'll have a follow-up to animations and dive deeper into all of these. I think there's so much that we can learn from each one individually, and then as an aggregate to be able to kind of step back and see what kind of larger trends or categories we can see and apply to our design processes. It's great, and I'm sure hopefully there are many others that we're hoping to share, but unfortunately we're running out of time. So look for an invite and a follow-up to this, and Ken and I are going to give a little bit of a what's next with the group. But before I do that, I want to thank Matthew again for a great presentation, along with Nadir, and thank you all for sharing. So Ken, what are we thinking of? Sure. And Ken, what are we thinking of for December? Are we thinking of taking the month off or trying to fit something in a very busy season?
Yeah, I think probably taking the month off. I don't know. I think everyone needs a bit of a break. But yeah, unless we get super inspired about something or some opportunity comes up, but it seems like we're probably going to skip that one and then start with something really cool in the new year.
And if somebody in the group wants to lead something, and there's a lot of planning behind the scenes to make something like this happen, although we want to keep it very kind of fluid in the moment. But if you have a lot of content and you want to discuss with us a way of curating that and creating a meeting, then we'd be happy to build something around an idea. December can be a tough time with the holidays and such, but we're open, but we're also open to taking a month off and resting and coming together in January as well. And in January, we're thinking of having more of a let's get together and talk about what we could do in the coming months sort of thing. We have some ideas, and I'm sure you all have ideas, so I'd rather make it more of a broad exercise in planning what we do together. And besides just meeting monthly, there are cohorts that we have. We have a group that's focused on city print, which is a 3D printing of a map of the entire boundaries of Boston, and then storytelling through projection mapping on top of that. So a few of you are part of that group. and meeting and talking outside of our monthly meetings. And then just recently with our last presentation on virtual reality, we're starting up, or we're taking in applications for a very small cohort of virtual design exploration, specifically with this company called Archeo. And if you're unfamiliar with that, just look at the recording from our last event. And if you're curious about where to find that recording, we're going to follow up and make sure that that link is on our website so that you can do that. And any curiosities at all, you can see that the email address for myself and for Ken are right on the VSA Design Visualization Knowledge Community website. That's all I can think of. Ken, anything else worth sharing before we wrap?
I think you covered it.
All right, excellent. Well, thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Have a great day.
Thanks,
And if we
everyone.
don't see you, then have a
Thank
great
you.
December. And
Thank you so much. Great work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Thank you all. So Matthew, you are definitely invited. Let's stay in
Okay.
touch.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Take care.